So if you want to put your first slide on, I start recording then. Oh, you're recording already.
Yes, I'm recording now. Okay, and okay. And this is the quote which I wanted to start this presentation with. I love it. I love it. By Wenger, the person who has developed the concept of community of practice. And he says that learning experience is not a simple accumulation of skills and knowledge, but an identity transforming experience which transforms who we are and what we can do. It is an experience of identity. And I find this quote very relevant on a personal level, because this is actually what happens whenever we take part in any training, any sort of professional development course, any sort of class. We are hoping that after having finished that event, we'll be able to, well, we'll be slightly different, that a little part of us will have changed, will have transformed. And this is what we wish for our students to happen. When it comes to virtual exchange, the model we'll be studying in this course is class to class. I'm saying that because there are various types of virtual exchange. It can be, for example, facilitated dialogue, in which students concentrate on controversial issues and they discuss them under the supervision of highly skilled facilitators. In this training, we focus on class-to-class exchange, which is based on the concept of classes 2, 3, or even 4, coming from different countries, different cultural backgrounds, and working together online under the supervision of teachers. Teacher supervision is an important element because just student exchanging emails is not really a class-to-class exchange. It takes instructors, right, to design tasks, to supervise their students, to make them reflect on what is happening. Well, I think it's good to clarify terminology. Some of you have been using the term COIL, which also means, well, the same type, or is used to denote the same type of online work. And it's used mostly in the States, and it stands for Collaborative Online International Learning. In the field of languages, we use the term telecollaboration. Some other terms you can come across include global and networked learning, online international exchange, and the one that we've adopted recently is virtual exchange. We have adopted that because it is commonly used in all project proposals, just because it has been accepted by European Commission. And well, at this stage, I'd like to share a testimony from a colleague, Katarzyna Radke, who is from Poznań University in Poland, and whom I met years ago at one of the workshops on open educational resources that I was doing at the time. And we met on several occasions later on. At some point, she started participating in various virtual exchange trainings and sessions. And then she took that leap and designed and participated in a virtual exchange of her own. And here you can see and read her comment. It was a partnership between Polish students and Finnish students. And this is how she remembers the exchange. My Finnish partner and I could see our students grow, literally like you see flowers grow in the garden in springtime. At first, some of them had fears, hesitated if they should take part in the VE experience. It required so much extra work with unknown people, and there was a need to use a foreign language. Although they were students of tourism, quite adventurous, they were afraid to leave their comfort zone, personal, linguistic, and cultural. And I'm sharing this with you because I think it captures beautifully the essence of virtual exchange. It helps people grow, literally. But this applies not only to students, but also to teachers. Kasia, an academic teacher, has grown herself a lot. From a language teacher, she has gone through all the stages of being a VE practitioner. Then she presented at conferences, and she's beginning to publish her own research papers. And now she's even training the faculty at her own university. So yes, virtual exchange is about leaving your comfort zone. This applies to both groups, to the students and the teachers. And this is multi-layered because it's not only about a professional comfort zone, it's also about linguistic, about cultural and personal as well. There are a couple of examples of various VE scenarios in our course, and I could read your comments that perhaps not all of them, or few of them might be applicable to your own context, but it wasn't our intention to make you copy those scenarios. No, it was just to show you the variety and the flexibility of virtual exchange as a teaching method. Because, well, the same teaching method can be applied to any academic context, to any type of academic courses, and to any actually intercultural configurations. Here you have a couple of other contexts, like, for example, students from the USA and the Netherlands can compare ecological footprints. Students can act as business consultants in Indonesia. Students from different countries, different cultures can analyze the concept of child welfare in those corresponding countries. Students might be engaged in designing a research proposal. Depending on the discipline, it may be applicable to various contexts. Students may design something, here, virtual collection of museum artifacts. Or they can develop, implement, and finally evaluate a mini research project together in groups. So as you can see, there is a multitude of contexts and topics that can be covered in virtual exchange projects. I'd like to share with you an example of an exchange that I've been doing for like 8 years now, with my virtual exchange partner, Andreas Müller-Hartmann from Heidelberg Pädagogische Hochschule. And I just wanted to share you the precise outline of the exchange, even though it may not address your context entirely. This is an exchange that takes place for the whole term, whole academic term. We start in October, November, and we finish in February. And our major learning objective for each of us is to make our students develop online teaching skills. And obviously I could achieve those objectives in lots of different ways. For example, I could have regular lectures, and also I could just make my students work in local pairs or local groups and make them go through a sequence of various tasks here in Poland. But there are so many other things I would like them to achieve in that exchange. First of all, I want them to experience the authenticity of the learning environment. So I really want them to make online. If they are training to be online teachers, right, I want them to work online. What's the point of making them working online if they reside in the same classroom? Very little. Then I want them to practice their language skills because they are training to be language teachers. And again, yes, obviously they can communicate in English in our classroom, but this is highly artificial. And there is no one to confront those, their linguistic competence with. And finally, and this is equally important to me, I really want them to experience those intercultural aspects. And my choice of a German partner is not random, obviously. There are so many sentiments running in my country. I really want my students to experience that collaboration with great colleagues from Germany. So as you can see, it's apart from, if you just compare the range of objectives that can be achieved through such a project, yes, it is much larger if you just modify it and if you change the delivery method, yes, and if you switch from regular teaching to virtual exchange teaching. What we do bear in mind when designing these exchanges every single year, we bear in mind class overlap. We want our students to work in real time. So early enough in an academic year, we make sure we'll have classes more or less in the same time slots. And well, for example, I need to book a computer room actually both of us need to book computer rooms at their universities. Each of us has to follow a certain procedure for doing that. But we already remember about, well, those requirements, and well, my authorities, for example, are aware of them as well. And this is like the model. It may look very boring. You don't have to go through it into detail. I'll show you the sequence of what is happening in the course. Please mind that it's a long exchange. It takes the whole term. Usually the length of an exchange is from 6 weeks. We do not recommend short exchanges. So from 6 weeks, well, to 13, 14, depending on the duration of your academic term. So we always start with different types of personal introductions because it's important. And then just because our students work in intercultural groups, we make them, create their group identities in the belief that it will help them consolidate as groups. Well, I'll show you this task later on. So they form group identities which are reflected in the common name for their group, the name that will reflect what they have in common. As you remember, the major objective in my course is developing online teaching skills with a focus on task design. So in this particular exchange, we start with giving them a model. We give them a model of an online activity. ICC stands for Intercultural Communicative Competence. And this activity is not a good one. So in the intercultural groups, they are to evaluate this activity and suggest improvements, following their common sense and their experience. On the basis of that, we formulate a sequence of criteria that should be used by teachers when designing or evaluating such activities. At that stage, our students are ready to create something on their own. So they create, each of the groups creates, designs their own ICC activity. Then we move on to evaluation stage, but it's not us evaluating their work, it's another partnering group. So for example, group A, or the work of group A is evaluated by group B, groups B by group C, etc., etc. So each of the groups receives feedback. Then, after having discussed the feedback and after having provided additional feedback from us, the teachers, the students are ready to create, design something more complex. And in this case, it is a sequence of activities. So these activities cover a particular topic. The students choose the topic, like, for example, urban landscapes or cyberbullying, you name them. They choose the age group, they choose their objectives, and they design a corresponding set of activities. Then we repeat the process of evaluation. And finally, after all these weeks, we have this final meeting, during a wrap-up meeting, during which each of the groups, each of the national groups, reflect on what has happened, what the learning incidents in the exchange were, what they've learned in the exchange, what was challenging, etc., etc. So this is how it works in my context. And apart from all these stages, here you can see the faces of the students who took part in those exchanges, my students to the left and the German students to the right. Just because of the pandemic, our last iteration took place entirely online, so you can see all our students working from Zoom. It was challenging, but it was possible. And I'm sharing all these faces with you just to show you that it's all about people and that the social aspect of these exchanges is extremely important. It is, I'm not saying that content is not important, it is, but it's like a different way of approaching that content. It is making students tackle different, sometimes very complex issues, but not on their own, but with the support of their intercultural partners. And just because the partners come from some other context, from another university, students feel much more motivated to contribute. This is just a single little trick that works because they feel responsible, because they know that if they fail the project, their partners will fail it as well. This is just an example from my own personal yard. But well, all the scenarios that you've read, including this one, have certain things in common. Well, they are authentic. As I said, each of these things could have been delivered in a traditional way, with me showing the tasks, making students evaluate tasks, design their own tasks, etc., etc. But that would be much less interesting, not to say boring. The context is multilingual because students can use whichever languages come in handy. In my case, this is English as lingua franca because both groups study English. But I may have students who also who do double MAs, one of them in German, the other one in English, and for them this is a great opportunity to use both languages. It is multicultural because in the process there are lots of little intercultural clashes that help students realize that their viewpoint is not the only one, that how they perceive things is not or doesn't have to be mainstream, that the same event might be interpreted differently. And apart from this major skeleton, this major backbone, we have a lot of little tasks in which we make students confront their views or compare their views on certain things. Our teachers are training to be, our students are training to be teachers. So, myself and Andreas, we were very surprised ourselves to discover that actually, even though our countries are neighboring ones, our educational systems are, so far apart, and that we actually follow different values in our educational systems. And those differences in values create a lot of little clashes in our intercultural groups. In virtual exchanges, the environment is unpredictable. And I'm smiling at this point because this is what I really appreciate. Even though we use more or less similar scenarios, more or less because we keep modifying them with every single iteration, we just implement little changes. We never know how well that journey is going to end. And again, I'm smiling because this is what makes my job much more exciting now than before. This is the moment when you start learning with your students, the moment when you discover that there is still something to learn for you, even though you've been teaching the same course for years. But now with every single group, we have like new issues, new critical learning incidents, we have new preferences, technology preferences of our students, and we need to follow. While a couple of years ago, our students would be happy contributing to discussion fora, traditional textual discussion fora. Now it's quite difficult to make them contribute. We really need to think of new ways, hence the idea of Flipgrid recordings, for example, or Padlet introduction. So seeking ways to make our content much more multimodal than before. And just because there is so much unpredictability in that teaching situation, yeah, it is so exciting. And it is also something I call cognitive motion. It's cognitive motion for all of us. For the students who discover, well, that for some reason their German partners won't be going to cemeteries on the 1st of November, which is our local big bank holiday. And for the German students that perhaps, our students will have other concepts of a particular issue. Virtual exchange is based on two major pillars. The first one is experiential learning, and the other one is task-based learning. And I'll start with the first one, because experiential learning is a concept which is universal. It will work in any discipline, because in any discipline, you can make students experience things rather than learn them or study them by heart, for example. So while in this cold learning cycle, we start with putting student in a particular experience. So we create a situation in which he or she experiences something. The important thing is to make the student reflect on that. So ask him or her, okay, did it work for you? What was the challenge? What worked fine? So very simple questions. And on the basis of these observations, the student or students are able to conceptualize on an abstract level. And by making some or drawing some conclusions, those abstract conclusions, they're able to modify their behavior and experiment. That's the the final stage. And on the basis of that experimentation, they are ready to enter another experience. So, for example, in my cycle, the one I've presented with you, this may, for example, refer to the way people communicate with one another. For example, we put the students in a situation when they have to discuss something. When we reflect, we notice that perhaps the communication wasn't very fruitful for the groups. And my students may say, well, the German students didn't respond well to what I was saying. And I had the feeling they felt offended. So on the basis of that, we may come up with a conclusion that perhaps your way of phrasing things was not very polite. Polish language is very direct. And sometimes when we just translate things, we may come across as rude. Yeah, so this is something we've all learned. So when we may create this concept of rudeness, or different levels of politeness in different languages, and in the next communication cycle, the students may feel urged to modify the way they communicate, and they test it out in another experience. You come from other fields than ours, perhaps, but I'm sure you can think of contexts in which experience will help your learners realize whether something works or not, or maybe something should be approached from a slightly different angle. So this is one of the pillars of virtual exchange. A lot has been said about why virtual exchange is important. Very briefly, experiential and collaborative learning. Those cultural lenses, sometimes it really takes some sort of confrontation to realize that, in fact, my viewpoint is quite limited. It really needs the otherness to make us realize of where we are. And this is what happens in virtual exchange. Transversal skills, so these will be skills that work across various disciplines and across contexts, like intercultural awareness, intercultural communicative competence, digital literacies, working effectively in virtual teams. These are all things that our students need to learn, and it's better for them to learn them or to practice them in low-stake contexts like our classrooms, not in high-stake ones like their future jobs and professions. They build diverse personal relationships, and I'm always happy when I hear my students say, wow, these German students are so nice. And you may say it sounds sad on one hand, but this is the moment when they start realizing that perhaps, they can enjoy very fruitful relationships with those students whom they've just met. Civil engagement, because, it is quite common in such projects to show students that the same thing, the same aspect can be approached from various perspectives, various cultural lenses, that, the participating cultures or countries may have different ways of approaching the same issue. And some students who never thought of taking advantage of studying abroad may start considering it, because suddenly they see, okay, it's not that horrible, it's not that scary. And I'm always very happy to talk about the benefits for the teachers, improving online teaching skills, co-teaching skills, which is great. And I'm always so sad to discover that the teachers at my own university, and I'm the only person doing virtual exchange at my university, they have so little, actually non-experience collaborating with colleagues. Teachers in their classrooms are quite lonely. This is my impression, because it's us and the students, and it's always good to have a partner with whom you can collaborate, you can exchange ideas, you can develop new things. You can learn new methods and approaches. For example, task-based learning is not very popular in my country, so I'm very happy I've learned it from Andreas Müller-Hartmann. Lots of great opportunities for the students, those that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And last but not least, research opportunities, right? So this is what Marga said. After having done a few exchanges, you start noticing patterns. You have your conclusions, you've learned your lessons. You have a lot of data to draw on while doing your own research, action research, for example. Okay, Before we move on, maybe I'll stop sharing and I'll ask you about your questions, comments. Maybe there is something you'd like to ask about at this stage.
Shall I break the ice just to make a couple of comments? What she was saying, just this is, you know, to give you a broader picture, how she has to book a multimedia room in her university, right, in order for the students to work together. But please remember that the whole point of virtual exchange is that it adapts to your own circumstances. Like, I don't book anything in my university because my students work outside the classroom. So all interaction between the partners is not done in class, is done outside the classroom, okay? Just because sometimes the logistics, as you know, are complex. So this is the way it works for me. We have face-to-face sessions, but the actual exchange takes place outside the classroom. Then all discussion is brought back to the classroom, to the face-to-face session the following week. Okay, but the students, I mean, we don't actually need to book anything. And also the language, I'm bringing it up because it's something that worries a lot of the Spanish teachers that I train. The language should be the language that suits you. What do I mean by this? Ideally, if your students level of, for example, of, you know, competence in English is great, or it's a, you know, B1, B2, you might be happy to pair them with students who speak English and then they use English as a lingua franca, okay? Or you might be happy, for example, to have a group that works in English and Spanish, okay? That's a possibility in an e-tandem, we call it e-tandem. However, there is no reason why it has to be that way. So for example, if you're thinking that your students don't have, you know, level of English, for example, that is good enough to pair them in the foreign language, pair them in the mother tongue. So you pair them with students in Mexico, or you pair them in students in Ireland who are learning Spanish as a foreign language. So the whole point of virtual exchange is that it's extremely flexible. And the idea is that you adapt it to whatever your circumstances are. Okay, so what Gosha was presenting is obviously how she has integrated it into her own classroom within her own situation and context, okay? But that doesn't mean that you have to integrate it that way. You will have to think of your circumstances, your own situation, your own students, your own content, and so on and so forth, and then decide what decisions you're going to make so that the exchange is of benefit to your situation or circumstances and students, okay? This is important because sometimes, you know, I know that you get frustrated and it's kind of, but my students don't have any English, and it's kind of, don't worry, English is not a problem. Then do it in Spanish, okay?
And that's why we put so many examples, like sample scenarios of virtual exchange in the course, just to make you peruse them and see how differently things can be approached. So at this stage, we are just sharing various examples with you, hoping you get inspired, even if they are not really personally relevant to your particular context. Are there any other comments?
Yeah, may I?
Sara, sí.
Yeah, I have, well, I was thinking before, when I was listening to you before in the previous presentation of all the people, I thought that maybe I could implement the virtual exchange to work in, not for a whole task during all the semester, but for example, I do a lot of practical sessions with students. So students can work with people in other countries to solve enigmas or to get an idea of how they are treated in other countries. Because, for example, diabetes mellitus is a problem. Is a problem that is very different treated in different countries. So I think that is very enriching for them to choose different situations, different biomedical or medicine situations that they can share. And I was wondering while listening to you, Gosia, if I do this, maybe it's better or not to change the pairs or the teams every week or not, because I think that what I learned from your talk is that it's better as much as they get to know each other to how they get involved and they work better. So I think that it's better not to change them every week. Is it possible? Is it that way better, isn't it?
It is better.
It is better.
It depends on your learning objectives, and this is the next issue we'll be discussing in a second. Because, for example, if your learning objective, if what you want for your students is to develop this ease of conversation with various people in various contexts, then such a quick change may work towards that final outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to focus on them solving issues and developing good good organizational skills, for example, it makes little, I think, because that would create an additional layer of challenge and stress, and it's not worth it, I think. And then just making them feel comfortable in their groups and develop their own group ecology would be more productive, I think.
And maybe also it is better that leaving them make the teams after breaking the ice, isn't it? Or no?
Leaving them. I mean, I tend to agree with Gosha. The thing is that, I mean, when students don't know each other, what the first thing they need to do in order to work collaboratively together is to create an environment in which they feel safe. They feel that they can actually work effectively together. And that's the reason why you tend to leave. So once you have created the groups at the beginning of the pairs, sometimes they're just dyads, they tend to continue working for the entirety of the project. But the reason for that is because once they get to know each other, and that is also a process that doesn't happen overnight. It takes, social skills also need to develop. So once they become used to one another, that actually puts them in the right situation for them to collaborate more effectively. And what you don't want to do is, they just become, familiar with one another. They started working together, and then which change them, and they start from scratch with another group all over again. So that is a challenge that actually Gosha was mentioning before. You don't want to create extra challenges, because you're going to see that collaboration and collaborating with others is challenging in itself. And it's very, very important that they feel comfortable with one another, that they feel they are safe, that they feel that they can ask any questions, they can say anything they like, and nothing happens, because they are there to help one another. Okay, but that is achieved over time. So changing, in my experience, is not very
not a good idea. And another thing that you said, Marga, is that you're doing the virtual exchange outside class, outside the class hours. So I guess that you give them like a guide on how to develop, or the amount of hours, or how it should work in the ideal world. And then you use the class meetings just to take a look to all the process and give feedback and all these kind of things, I guess.
Correct. Like, I was listening to you, and you were saying that you use a lot of case studies, right?
Yeah.
And you also are in charge of external practices. Okay, so for example, imagine that you want your students to, over a period of 6 weeks, for example, you want your students to prepare 3 case studies. It is an example that I'm just making up for you, right? So imagine, for example, that you give them a case study, and you want them to, first of all, analyze a case study from a national perspective. So that the first thing will be, I look at this case study from a Spanish perspective, they look from a British perspective, from a German perspective, from whatever perspective, okay? They do that, so they arrange to meet outside the classroom. So first of all, the students in your class work together, okay, outside the classroom. They work online. The students in Britain work together online. The students in Germany, they work together online. Okay, so first of all, at the local level. And then you tell them that what you want to do is to contrast and compare the approaches, the approaches to the same case study from the Spanish perspective. So that is when they meet. Okay, so you can actually have them first working within your classroom, within your group, at a local level. Then you pair them together in groups, and they analyze the perspective from a German and Spanish point of view, for example. Okay, so the task itself is done outside the classroom. What I give them is, okay, Step number one, you're going to have a look at this case study from your own perspective, local. Then you're going to get together with your partner and you're going to exchange information about your different perspectives. And then task number three, now you're going to get together and you're going to create, on the basis of what you've learned from these case studies, you're going to create a policy to do blah. Like, I mean, I'm just thinking of one of the training I did before. And we had a very heterogeneous group of participants. So I have participants from medicine, I have participants from engineering in the same group, right? These were teachers. I had somebody else from advertising and marketing, and they actually worked together from their different perspectives on the COVID pandemic. And they came up with this idea, for example, on how how the COVID pandemic had been analyzed from the Spanish point of view, what the government measures have been like, how it was, the information was given, for example, to the citizenship, and in the United States, and so on and so forth. Then the person doing the marketing campaign was saying, okay, so what kind of campaigns did you have? How was this, how did it appear in the newspaper? Or what kind of notice boards did you have out there? So what was the campaigning like in Spain and in the United States? Okay. And after they analyzed all that, then they got together to design a campaign to encourage people to get the vaccine. A campaign that would work in the United States and in Spain. So the idea is we exchange information about our own realities, we learn from one another, and then we create something together that takes into account the wider picture.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, and all this then, of course, can be discussed in your classroom. So you might decide to tell your students, okay, so now that you have been discussing with your partner, these case studies, then you take the students into your classroom, and for the final, or you can say, okay, what have you learned? And you can get your students, for example, to give a PowerPoint presentation on that information. For example, they can give you a PowerPoint presentation, they can create an essay together. I mean, the final product, it can be a podcast. My students love podcasting. So they decided they wanted to do a podcast, or they wanted to interview one another and create a radio program. So you're going to see that the flexibility is out there. The technology is there to help you. It all depends on what your pedagogical objectives are. That is part of what we are going to be discussing next.
Really nice, thank you.
Yeah, just wanted to add one more thing to what Marga has just said, the diversity. The greater the diversity, the greater the pedagogical potential. And actually, in Virtual Exchange, we love the diversity card. And that's why we love working with people from other cultures, because this is when we learn. Yes, this is when we grow, when there are some new elements, diverse elements in the exchange. That's why those different contexts, Marga, that you've just cited, like a group of advertising experts and like biomedicine experts, and you name them, the greater the diversity of perspectives, the better. We are running out of time, so if you don't mind, I'll initiate the next thing. I'm afraid we need to continue online, but I just wanted to signal that the very first step towards virtual exchange design is deciding on your educational goals. And when I was a student and I was learning about educational goals, I would always get irritated because it didn't mean much to me. But now I'm an experienced educator and teacher, and I know that this is a very simple thing. This is you knowing what you want your students to have achieved after that particular class unit, project, whatever. So it's like on entering any kind of classroom, be it virtual or conventional. On entering the classroom, you may not know how you want to work. You may play it by ear, for example, but you really need to know what you want your students to have achieved. So maybe this is the feeling, you know, when you, for example, when you are to replace a colleague on the last minute basis, for example, when you know, okay, I'm supposed to have achieved that, but I haven't developed any resources for that. But then you improvise, and it can be very productive, and you can be very successful. But the very first step is, okay, on opening the door, you need to know what that thing is going to be. The major problem with educational objectives is that they tend to be very broad, especially in the context of virtual exchange. When we ask teachers what they want their students to have achieved, they use very broad, very general statements like language skills. I want them to improve their language skills, or I want them to improve their digital literacy or their intercultural competence. And it is not enough, because this is very, very broad. So the key to success is looking at just 2 or 3 learning objectives at the start and making them very precise by, for example, following these sentence openings. At the end of the exchange, I expect my students to be able to do what? And the next one, their abilities will be evidenced by. I'm a language teacher, so for me, saying to be able to improve their language skills is really, it doesn't mean anything. But I may expect my students to be able to communicate freely in a multimodal environment and be able to present, to make an oral presentation in front of the audience. And their abilities will be evidenced by actually them making this presentation and having it recorded. Yes, for the audience in mind. When you have in mind your content, yes, the course you're teaching and the particular content, so which parts of the content do you want to be the focus of the exchange, and how are you going to have that knowledge measured? For example, in case of highly theoretical courses, it might be a good idea to make the students produce learning resources in which certain concepts are clarified, and use infographics for that. For example, certain theories can be presented. You have a pool of various theories of theoretical concepts, and you make students working in groups create like visual representation of this knowledge and then put on display. In order to present something visually, you need to understand it well, right? So this is how this understanding can be measured. It's just an example. And we'd like you to see this little activity as the beginning of your design process. I'll put these, we'll have a post-meeting discussion forum in our course. And well, originally we wanted you to do it in breakout rooms today, but we don't have time left for that. So let's move this activity. And this is an example of playing by ear, but we really know what we want you to have created. We really want each of you to have specified their learning objectives. And even if now you feel still hesitant, you don't know, maybe it's too much, you haven't decided yet, it's okay. It's just the beginning of the process. And even if you come up with something today or tomorrow, after a couple of weeks, you may realize, well, it's not precise enough, or well, I've changed my mind, and it's still okay, right? So kind of homework, which will be put in on this Moodle platform, will be, all right, first think what type of course or which course would you like to enrich with virtual exchange, and focus on one to start with, not too many, just one. And within that particular course, what your learning objectives or educational goals would be. Try to make them specific, not too general, and share them with others, because the best proof of clarity is just checking whether others see eye in eye with you. Maybe they will have questions, maybe other participants will expect you to clarify those learning objectives. Maybe they won't be clear enough, who knows? But let's share, okay? And the next module to be unveiled on Sunday is on task design. So if you could please spare a moment just to go through the content. We'll continue discussing what was started in week 2 during our next meeting. Maybe I'll stop recording now.
Okay, I'm just going to add something in case that is useful for you when you start thinking of pedagogical objectives. Okay, think also in terms of competencies, because the actual environment, virtual exchange, okay, is going to help your students develop certain competencies. Okay, if you put the focus there. Digital competence, okay, if you actually put the focus there, it can be one of them, because your students are going to have to use certain technologies. You're going to be deciding on those technologies, and you might actually decide that you want to assess whether the students actually manage, you know, the technology well. So this is one aspect. If you're going to have your students working with students from other countries, you might want to decide that you know, to put the focus on development of social skills or intercultural skills. So please take competencies for employability. These are competencies for employability or transversal competencies. We're talking about the same thing, yeah? Take those into account when you are deciding on your pedagogical objectives, right? It's quite useful, but at least it helps me.